This morning I'm not going to preach a message as such. I'm going to, since it's Father's Day, I'm going to share a tribute to my father with you as a congregation. There's a picture of my mom and dad. I thought you ought to be able to at least be able to attach a face to the name. My dad's name was Willie, and my mom's name was Really. I used to have fun with that. I'd pretend like I was married, and I'd say, Willie, will you take Really for your wife? And Really, will you take Willie, really? But that was Willie B. He didn't have a middle name as B. That was it. Just initial. Willie B. Ward. And all of the nieces and nephews and all called him Uncle B. That was his name, Uncle B. And a lot of people just called him Millie B. They knew him. And some of them just called him B. But he went by Willie. My mom was Really Mae Durance. That's her name. Really Mae was her middle name. And they were married at a very young age. But before we get into that, I want us to look at a couple of scriptures, and then I'm going to share some things with you about them, and then what my dad called me, what I learned from my dad in life. Proverbs 20, verse 7. Proverbs 20, verse 7, and then also Proverbs 23, and verses 22 and 24. There are a lot of scriptures in the Bible that you can look at on Father's Day, but I want to point these out. In Proverbs 20 and verse 7, it says, the godly walk with integrity. Excuse me. Blessed are the children, or their children, who follow them. The godly walk with integrity, and some say parents, some versions. Walk with integrity, and blessed are the children who follow them. And then in chapter 23, just over a few pages, 22 and verses 24. Verses 22 says, listen to your father who gave you life. And don't despise your mother when she is old. And then in verse 24 it says, the father of godly children has cause for joy. What a pleasure to have children who are wise. How true that is. My dad was born in Georgia. He grew up in a poor family. They were just poor farmers. His dad was a short. I don't know where we got our height from, because his dad was short. Short guy, kind of like Larry, short. He was maybe about your size. He was, he really was.
He must be really.
And they farmed for a living, but it's back in those days, you know. And Dad and Mom lived through the Depression era, but back when they were growing up as children, they lived on the farm. They were poor. They didn't have a lot. I remember Dad telling me many times that sometimes all they would have to eat is some beans and cornbread. A lot of stuff that they killed, they grew, if they had cattle or pigs and all, that's how they got some of their meat. Dad was not allowed, didn't get to go to school very much. My dad had about a third grade education. He could write, he could write his name, of course, and all, but he couldn't pick up the Bible and read it to me. He wasn't able to do that. He could read some words and some things, but he wasn't able just to pick up a newspaper and read it all. Look at the pictures and things and figure some things out in some words. But he didn't get the chance to go to school much. Back then, when you were needed on the farm to work the farm, they pulled you out of school. And so many times he was pulled out of school to work on the farm. On the days that he did get to go to school, he would talk about how sometimes they would be going to school barefoot. He talk about how he would talk about how in class, it would have been interesting to know, to me, it would have been interesting to know if my dad had an opportunity to have a full education, what he could have done with his life. But not having a full education limits you. And but when he went to school, he said when they would sometimes have drawing contests, and he would always win the drawing contest. And even though my dad never had much education, he was good at math. I don't know where it came from, how it happened. It just, I remember as being in school and sitting there at the kitchen table, trying to figure out a math problem, one of those reading problems, you know, that you read. I hated those things. And I couldn't figure those things out. And I would sit there and I would read, and I read it to him, and he told me the answer. I said, that's right. I said, how did you get that answer? He said, I don't know how to tell you how I got it. And I thought, well, this is amazing that you can tell me this answer. You have a third grade education, that you were able to do that. And I just always thought that was amazing that he was able to do that. But he said, I can't really tell you step by step how I got that answer. But that was his childhood. Then he had 4 brothers. He had Larry and Johnny and Jesse and Robert and a sister named Mamie. And he was the oldest of the brothers. And it's interesting because 3 brothers married 3 sisters. My mom had two other sisters, Vincy and Nellie. And Larry married Nellie, and Johnny married Vincy. They never had any children. Johnny died when he was young. Larry died when he was young. And then my dad married my mom. So 3 brothers married 3 sisters. And then, of course, when Nellie and Larry had 2 girls, and my mom had us, my brother and I, so we became double first cousins. Double first cousins, you're almost like brother and sister. That's how close you are. So, it was a very interesting thing. You don't often see that, 3 brothers marrying 3 sisters, but that happened. And they got married at a very young age. I mean, we talk about it today, but my dad was 18, and my mom, there's some question about it. It says, in one way it says she was 15 or 16, but it looks like she was 15. So 18 and 15, that's kids marrying kids. But let me tell you something, back then, if you think about it, kids had to grow up fast back then because of what they had to do, because of what was required of them. But they were married 12 years. I don't know what took them so long. They were married 12 years before I came along and my brother came along. My brother came along first. And then after he was born, my dad was still farming at that time. But he hurt his back and he had to get out of the farming. And they moved to Orlando, Florida. I don't know why they chose Orlando, but they moved to Orlando, Florida. And that's where I was born, in Orlando. So I became one of those native Floridians. But they had, Dad worked for the city of Orlando for 30 years. There were, on different occasions, he was offered a supervisor's job, but he never would take it. Now, he would always tell us, well, he could make more money driving the truck than he could being a supervisor. But I think part of the problem that he wouldn't take that is because of his education. He was afraid that things would be required of him that he wasn't able to do, so he stayed in that position. But Dad was, Mom worked for Archway Cookies, so if you ever go into the grocery store and buy Archway Cookies, she worked there for about 30 years, making Archway, helping them package and do Archway Cookies. I even worked there for 2 weeks during the summer when I was in college, and I was off, went home for the summer and went there and worked. It was very interesting work, but I was also working another full-time job, keeping the gas station open all night. So it was interesting work to see that. But Dad worked there for that many years, and he was a loyal employee. As I said, growing up, he didn't have much education, didn't have an opportunity to get much education. He, of course, he loved art. He loved to do artwork and that type of things. But he was a great man. And there were some things that I learned from my dad. I had to think about. So I thought about his life. He died in '99. My mom died in 2003. And I got to thinking about some of the things that I learned from my father growing up. And I wanted to share those this morning. Number one, I learned financial responsibility. Now you can imagine growing up during the Depression years. We haven't had to live through that, but my parents lived through those Depression years when they had very little to eat. I mean, they didn't have much at all. And things were hard to come by during the Depression years. And and I found out that most people that lived through that Depression years have a whole different view about finances than those of us who live today. But he was a penny pincher, and he learned that because of depression, because of not having enough during those times, and sometimes not having enough food. There's one characteristic of my dad that I realized is that he never wanted to see anybody go hungry. And I think that's because he'd been hungry at times. And he never wanted anyone to go hungry. I mean, if you came to our table, he wanted you to have enough food, or if they were feeding him when they worked in catering service after they retired for a while. He wanted to make sure that people had enough to eat. But he taught us a lot of things. He would say, son, don't spend more than you make. Don't spend more than you make. That's pretty good advice. Because there's too many people today who are spending way more than you make, and they're in debt up to here. So the first thing he says, don't spend more than you make. And my dad and mom, they sacrificed so much. There are times when I would be in the store with him, and there'd be something that he might want, maybe need, and he may have the money in his pocket, but he would not give it. I've seen him when we've gone to on vacations and things like to SeaWorld and Disney World, and my dad would walk around there. He'd go over to a water fountain and drink the water from the water fountain before he'd go pay $3 or $4 for a Coke. And that's all stems out of that coming through that depression and what they experienced. It was more important for him to save that because the idea was there is going to come a day when I may need that. You never know what's going to happen in the future. And that's wise, because today we try to teach people, even when I'm in the financial business, teaching people you need to have an emergency fund. You need to take a portion of your money and set it aside every week so that when that refrigerator breaks down or that car breaks down, you don't have to run to the bank and borrow money. You've got an emergency fund over here that you can draw from. And you don't have to go in debt to take care of that. And that's kind of my dad, even though he did never put it in those words, that's kind of the way he lived. I've got money here. I'm going to save this because I may need it someday for something that I really need more than something that I just want. So he always paid his bills on time. My dad and mom had perfect credit. They paid their bills on time. Whatever they had to do, no matter what bills they had, it was paid and paid on time, usually before. So I learned that. You got an obligation, take care of it, and take care of it on time. Don't wait till the last minute and hope it gets in. Don't pay late fees because you didn't do what you should have done. You know, get that in, pay it, pay your bills on time. Save as much as you can. He told me that. Save as much, put some back. Save so much out of it. And every time that they could, they were putting so much, and they didn't make a lot of money. My mom and dad never made a lot of money. I mean, he worked for the city of Orlando for 30 years. And he never made the, you know, $40 and $50 and $60,000 a year that you can make today pretty easily. Didn't make that. They both worked together all their life. All the years that we grew up, my brother and I grew up, my mom and dad worked. They had to make a living, to be able to provide. But they did provide. They took care of us. And he would save as much as he could. As much as he could put back, he kept putting it back. He kept putting it back, and he kept saving and saving and saving. I was amazed at the amount that you had already saved by the time he retired. He didn't like to be in debt. My dad never liked to be in debt. If they used a credit card, it was paid to get gas. It was paid off. He had a car that he had to put, you know, most time he had to buy cars on installment plans, but he would pay it off as quick as he could. You know, and then when he retired and he had saved up this money, he couldn't stand having that house payment, so he went and paid off his house so they could live debt free during retirement. That's the way he did. He says he didn't have credit card debt. I'm amazed at the debt that people have today on credit cards. And they can't pay it off because they pay the minimum amount, and they'll be paying the minimum amount from now till the day they die. But some of them owe 30 and 40 and 50 and 60. I've seen it. My dad never had credit card debt. Did he use credit cards? Yes, but he never had debt because he always paid it off. He never put more on that card than they could pay off. Credit cards are not evil in themselves. You see, it's how you use them that makes them bad. If you use them right, they can be a good tool in cases when you have emergencies and things. But if you're not careful, they can also be evil. But he never had credit card debt. They always paid everything off. He would not put a lot of money. He liked to pay things by cash. They had joint accounts. Today you hear a lot, well, I've got my account and she's got hers, and that's my money and that's her money, and never two shall be mixed. That's not the way mom and dad were. They had a joint account, and it was not her money, my money, although they realized he made this and she made that. It came into an account. It was put together. And out of that fund, they paid their bills. We'll pay this out of yours, and we'll pay this out of mine, and this we'll do. That's the way they operated. Now, Dad was not much education, but he kept that checkbook. He knew how to add and subtract. And he kept that checkbook to the penny. He knew exactly what was in it, how much they had. So I learned financial responsibility from my dad, from my parents, you know, to not spend more than what you make. And I'll be honest with you, during ministry years, it was difficult. I never made a lot of money in ministry. I didn't go into ministry for money. I could have chosen any other profession, made a lot more money. I didn't go into ministry for that. I was called of God. And God took care of us and provided for us. We didn't have everything we wanted, so we had everything we needed. Couldn't always provide everything I wanted for my boys and all, but God took care of us. And through the course of the years and doing things, and during those times, we had to, you know, during those years I had to borrow money and things to be able to even pay income taxes at the end of the year, because that was a burden that fell on us. But we always paid everything on time. And even today, because of my dad, our credit is good. You know, and because of my dad and watching them, we today live with no debt. And we're grateful. That's something that he told us. Secondly, a work ethic. I don't know that I've ever seen any two people that work harder than my mom or my dad. I see my dad get up and go to work when he didn't feel like going to work, when he probably should have been in bed, but he had a work ethic. He would get up and he would go to work. He was always on time. Always on time. He was never late. If he was ever late, it's because something happened. But he was never late, and I guess that's where I get mine from, because I don't want to be late to anything. I'm there, I'm early. Because most of y'all know I'll be here early, I'll be here ahead of time. I don't care what appointment it is, I'm going to be there. And I think I learned that from my dad. He was a faithful employee. He was faithful to his job. They could depend on him. They didn't have to ask, where is Willie this morning? He was there. He was the kind of employee that any employer would want working in their company, because he was always there, always faithful, always doing his job. Always on time, dependable. And I learned that from my dad. Whatever you do, your work ethic, be a hard worker. I guess our family's always been a hard worker. We don't mind hard work. We don't mind getting out there and doing it, even when we don't feel like it. So we learned that. Be a hard worker. Be faithful to your employee. I always try to be faithful to my employee. I was like my dad. They knew at O&L Federal Credit Union in Columbus Metro, when I worked there in Columbus, they knew that Jerry was going to be there. They didn't have to worry about it. I learned that through my dad, that work ethic. I also learned honesty through my dad. His word was his bond. You didn't have to sign a contract with my dad, although there were times when they had to sign contracts, but it wouldn't have made any difference for my dad. Once he had an agreement with you, he would fulfill that agreement. If he ever borrowed money from anyone and he told them, I'll pay you back on a certain day, you could guarantee you he'd be paid back. If he couldn't pay it back for some reason, he would say, wait, this is what, he wouldn't just leave you hanging. He'd say, this is what happened, and I'll pay you back. But he was honest. His word, if he told you that he was going to do something, he would do it. Humorous story, my son's sitting here. We were talking about it not too long ago when they were small and went down. They learned that my dad meant what he said. When they were down there and spending some time with my mom and my dad, we weren't there. And they'd spend some time with them, and they were doing something, I don't remember, misbehaving, I don't remember what. He had told them to stop. He was going to give them whipping, but they didn't stop. And he made a believer out of them. Of course, he didn't hurt him. He just gave him a little swat on him. But the thing that is that it shocked them to death. They didn't think Grandpa would ever do that. But Grandpa did. Grandpa said, I'm going to do this, and he did it. You didn't need a contract with my dad. He was honest. He told the truth. He spoke the truth. And you could depend on his word. And that means a lot. Today, in this day and age, it's hard to depend on people's words. They'll just tell you anything, say anything. But my dad wasn't like that. He's taught me that. Be dependable. If you say you're going to do something, do it. If you can't do it, then don't just let people hang, tell them why. But keep your word. Do what you say you're going to do. He was a good provider. He took care of his family. He made sure that there was food on the table, that there was a roof over our head, and that there was clothes on our back. Every need that we had, he took care of. We didn't have an abundance of things, and we didn't have all the things that we wanted, but he took care of us. There was nothing that he wouldn't do for his family. The only regret that he ever had was that sometimes he didn't have the money to do what he wanted to do. That was the regret. Didn't always have the money to do what he wanted to do. He sacrificed for his family. My dad, I can remember when I was getting ready to go to Gulf Coast Bible College, the first year you weren't allowed to have a car, but the second year you could. And you got to realize this is what, almost 50 years ago, I guess. He went out in the second year and he paid $600 and bought me this car that is an Oldsmobile, 98 Oldsmobile, a bit like a tank. And it was a good car while it lasted, but the transmission went out of it. But he had to sacrifice. You have to understand, he had to sacrifice to get that car. They weren't able to say, well, I'm going to send you to college and we'll just pay all your tuition. Even back then, though, the tuition wasn't that much. They weren't able to pay all that tuition. They paid the very first year. They sacrificed to pay the very first year. And then I worked, of course, when I was in college, and I paid all the other years. And they sacrificed to help buy books and keep the insurance on the car. That's what they did. But they sacrificed to give me that. And I remember when that car broke down and I had to get something else. My dad had a little Falcon, the old Ford Falcon, that he loved that little car. It was such a good little car, a little 6-cylinder. He loved that car. But he gave me that car and went out and bought him another one. He sacrificed for his kids. He had a sense of humor. Sometimes I never knew what he was going to do or what he was going to say, but he loved to laugh. I can see him now when he laughs and that big smile comes over his face, and he was just, the whole body would shake when he would laugh. He could be funny. I remember on a trip that we were going to Nebraska. He was driving and we were in the right lane. It was actually a 4-lane, and he was in the right lane, and they were doing some work on the road up ahead, and this guy was standing there with a flag, trying to tell everybody to get over to the left there. And I was sitting next to him, and he was going down he was going down there, just speeding down there, and this guy was starting to look at him, and he wasn't going. I looked over down and said, Dad, are you going to run over that guy? And all of a sudden, he swerves over, and this guy threw up his hands, and stepped back like this. They're like, what in the world are you doing? I could just hear him cussing at my dad. And my dad's sitting over there laughing. Just laughing with a big smile on his face. And he thought it was so funny. But you just never know. But the funniest thing, I think, happened on that trip when he got pulled over. My dad was so nervous. I mean, he couldn't even get his billfold out of his pocket to get his license out. He was so nervous. And that cop came up to his window like, oh, do you know why I stopped you? He says, you were speeding. He says, I is? I is? Yeah, I mean, he couldn't even talk. He was so nervous about it. And it was just funny. But people love my dad. I don't know that my dad had an enemy in the world. Whether it was at church or in the community, at work, they loved my dad. And Dad was a Christian. I guess if there's anything that he gave me that's the most important of all, is that he was a Christian. He loved the Lord. He had a simple faith. You have to understand, he couldn't pick up this Bible and read it and teach it to me. He had to teach it to me through his life, through his example. As you were saying, you'd rather see an example than to hear one. Well, he taught it through example. He had just a simple faith. He got his understanding of what it meant to be a Christian by sitting in Sunday school classes and listening to the teacher and sitting in services and hearing the preacher preach the Word of God. And at some point in his life, the Lord spoke to him, and he gave his heart and life to the Lord and became a Christian. He loved the church. I remember in the Orlando church, my dad served as an usher for numbers of years. I don't even remember how many years he served there, but he served a number of years. And in that particular church growing up, all the ushers had the same kind of coat. I mean, if it was a blue, they all wore blue coats. If they had green, they all wore green coats. So it looked very professional when they walked down, so they all looked alike. They would be there on the Sundays that he served. He would be there early. And he was one of the greeters that the usher had to greet people as they came in. And my dad always had a smile on his face, and they were always happy. And people would talk about my dad's smile and how he would greet them and laugh and just carry on with them. He loved the church. They even worked, and I don't know why he did that. I wouldn't do it. He worked in the nursery. Mom and Dad worked. I'm talking about the little bitty babies. Taking care of them, of course. My dad always loved little babies. He did. But I noticed as my dad got older, I think his love for him changed. He got more impatient, I think, as he got older. But Mom and Dad were working the nursery, and I thought, here they are, all the way up in years, and they're there at that church, retired, and they're working in the nursery, help take care of someone else's kids so they could be in church. So they love the church. They love going to church. We went Sunday morning, Sunday night, and Wednesday night. We were in service. And he taught us not by reading scripture or trying to read the Bible and explaining to us what it was. He taught us not by preaching to us all the time or, quoting Bible verses that he might know to us. He taught us by example, by how he lived. He taught us love by loving us. He taught us giving by giving to others. He taught us tithing, not by talking about it, but by doing it. Every Sunday and every paycheck, always the 10th came out for the Lord. Always. So he taught it not by talking about it, he taught it by doing it. He taught us responsibility by being responsible. He taught us loyalty by being loyal. He taught us financial responsibility by being financially responsible. He taught us the value of a good name by living an honorable life. Was my dad perfect? Not by a long shot. He made his mistakes. We all do. Because we're human. Were there times of regret my dad had? Sure. Were there times when he had to say, forgive me? Sure. He wasn't perfect. He was just a man that was trying to do the very best he could with what he had and follow the Lord the best he knew how. Just a simple man. Dad loved the Lord. A lot of what I am today is because of who he was then. And the greatest thing that he gave me is to know that when God called him home, that you can go on up. When God called him home, I didn't have to worry about where my dad was.
Did you call him?
No, Larry, you can sit down.
Oh.
I didn't have to worry about where he was because I knew where he was. Because he loved the Lord, he died in Christ. Let me share this poem with you. I guess it's only natural as the years pass away to think about our childhood, the things of yesterday.
place where we were born. It may have been a palace or just a humble little home. The roof could be leaking. The floor rough and bare. That didn't seem to matter. As long as Mom and Dad were there. I know you remember many things about your childhood that make you glad. I especially like to think about my boyhood. With my dad. I remember how he'd wake me each morning before day, and sometimes I'd be so sleepy I'd just wish he'd go away. But then he'd sit down by me and put his hand upon my head and say, "Son, you better get up. That team's got to be fed." And then as he was leaving, I would always hear him say, "Put your hand upon us, Lord. Keep us through this day." Somehow those words would stir me, and sleep for me would fade, and I'd grab old ragged breeches and the shirt my mom had made, and we'd head out to war. Well, I can almost see us now. Pa would feed the horses while I would milk the cow. And then when he was finished, he'd quietly slip away to a little spot down the hillside where he seemed to like to pray. He'd sit down on a log or maybe lean against a tree. But usually as I he'd get down on one knee. And oh, how I remember the tingle on my skin as Pa would always start his prayer with, "Lord, it's me again." Many years have passed and gone since Pa went away. I still miss the things he used to do and say. I guess he's mighty happy in that new home he's found. With all the angels singing, the mountains around, and someday we'll meet him in a place that's free from sin. And it's all because my daddy prayed, "Lord, it's me again." Let's pray. Father, thank you. Thank you for your love. Thank you for your blessings. Thank you for this day. Thank you for a time of remembering. Thank you for my parents. Thank you for my dad. Lord, you know he wasn't perfect. He was just a simple man, living the best he could, doing the best he knew how. Didn't always make right choices or right decisions, but you always were there to help guide him. Thank you for the lessons that I have learned through him. And I pray, Lord, that I can only be as good as he was in many areas of his life. Lord, I just pray that as we all think about Father's Day here, whether our fathers are still living or whether they're gone home, help us to realize that if they were living for Christ, then the best thing that we could ever give to them is to live for Christ too. The best way we could ever honor them is to live for you. Be with us, guide us, and direct us. Take care of us. Lord, we thank you for all that you do. In Jesus' name, amen. Let's stand and we'll